My name is Ryan. I did not grow up in the glass and steel canyons of Chicago. My roots are buried deep in the red soil backwaters of southern Louisiana, in a remote little place called Bayou Hollow. Even though I have lived in the city for years, the memory of that one night still chases me. Whether it was supernatural, spectral, or merely the imagination of frightened minds, I do not know. But the cold shadow of that night fell across my life so profoundly that I have never been free of it. It happened about 15 years ago. Back then, our town was cut off in ways the city never was. Electricity reached us, but during the rainy season, it was a rare and fickle visitor. When the sky opened and the heavy rains came, the red clay roads turned slick and treacherous. The narrow footpaths that cut across the rice paddies vanished underwater. Along those paths, clusters of tall cane and reeds swayed and whispered, and in the rain, their sound turned into a soft, secretive hissing. At the center of the town stood an old wooden church, its white paint peeling like sunburnt skin, and beside it a massive oak tree, gnarled and towering, as if it had watched generations pass. The weekly market beside the riverbank was where the town's pulse beat, small and lively. But the cemetery, that place lay beyond the last farm, at the edge of the marsh and canebrake. You had to pass paddy fields and edge the thick reeds to reach it. Even by daylight, people avoided it. By night, it was a place of legend. Locals whispered stories of disembodied weeping, the coming and going of shadowy figures, and muffled, breathless whispers that drifted in the wind. The most respected man in our town was Mr. Nelson. Well into his 80s, he carried a strength and generosity that never seemed to diminish. He had built a primary school out of his own savings and would sometimes bring doctors from the city to treat those who could not afford care. Everyone loved and honored him like family. One rainy morning came the news. Mr. Nelson had died. From dawn, the rain showed no sign of stopping. The sky was a heavy blanket of black clouds, and every so often lightning cracked and thunder rolled, shaking the bones of the town. The sorrow spread instantly. By evening, the townsfolk gathered for his burial. A stretcher borne by 25-30 neighbors carried him down the clay path. I walked among them out of respect for the old man. To reach the grave, we had to wade through the mud between the paddies. The path swallowed boots halfway up, and the lanterns and torches we carried guttered and trembled in the wet air. When we reached the cemetery, it was nearly 10:30 at night. The diggers began their work. The silence around us was so deep that it felt as if we had stepped into another world. Only the faint droning of insects and the distant rumble of thunder filled the void. Just as the men were lowering the bier and preparing to place the body into the grave, an old villager suddenly shouted, his voice raw with terror. "Look! There's someone standing by the cane!" he cried. We all stopped as one. Lightning flashed, and for a heartbeat I saw it, a tall, thin silhouette among the reeds. Its clothes were ragged and sodden. Its hair hung in matted strands. It bent its head, its hands working the wet earth as if digging. My chest tightened. It seemed to move slowly toward the grave. A few braver men ran toward the figure, but when they reached the place, there was nothing. Only deep footprints pressed into the mud and fresh scrape marks on the ground, as if something had been clawed up. The villagers stood with their mouths open, speechless and pale as the lantern flames. The air turned colder, as if the rain itself had a chill. We finished the burial somehow, hurried, each of us soaked and shivering, and moved back toward the town as if fleeing. We reached Mr. Nelson's house around midnight. As we approached, a woman's cry cut through the air, a thin, heart-wrenching keening that made the skin on my neck prickle. At first, I thought it might be someone from the family mourning inside, but when we stepped into the yard, we found the house oddly still. Inside, no one sobbed. Faces were dry, eyes empty and motionless. Yet that keening sound continued outside, strangely clear, as though it had no source. It traveled like wind through the trees, close and distant at once. I felt, in the bones of me, a cold like packed snow. By morning, the rumor mill was alive. Some said they had seen the figure again near the oak, that it slipped out from the reeds and moved back toward the graves as if searching for something. One voice claimed to have watched the soil of Nelson's grave heave, as if something underneath pushed at it from within. Such tales may have been gossip, but to those of us who stood in the mud that night, the terror was real on our faces still. For days the village wore a sullen silence. Nobody wanted to speak openly about that hour. As if by agreement, folks folded the fear and the story into themselves and pretended it was not there. Still, anyone who passed near Mr. Nelson's front yard said they could hear, in the whisper of the cane, a muffled lament. The morning after, a few of us, fools or else driven by curiosity, went back to the graveyard in daylight. Sunlight made the place ordinary again, but nothing about the scene felt the same as earlier. Nelson's grave was still fresh. Beside the place where the shadow had clawed the ground were clear footprints in the mud, and scattered across the soil lay old coins, tarnished and unlike anything we used. Among them were bits of dried bone, fragments like splinters, bleached and brittle. It looked like something had been brought up from the earth. Most unsettling of all, crows, a gaggle of them, had settled directly above the grave. Not a single bird cawed. They simply stood, motionless, eyes fixed on the mound, as if waiting for something. Their silence felt heavier than their cries would have been. A chill ran through us. A few days later, Mr. Nelson's family found old documents in a chest in the house. They were brittle, written in an ink browned by time. The papers told us that years ago, before the present church stood, this patch of land had been home to a small temple belonging to a solitary mystic. People called him a sage. Others said a hermit. In life, he was known for odd rituals. After his death, the villagers had torn down the temple, and the place was given over to graves. The documents hinted that the hermit had studied death, not as the end, but as a doorway. He had been obsessed with the idea that the soul did not immediately leave the body, that something lingered in the shell. He had sought a way to bind that lingered essence to his will. When they told us this, a new kind of dread seeped through the town. Could the figure be the hermit's restless spirit returning to pry at the graves? Was he seeking something buried in the earth? The old men said many things about rites, about the seeming impossible persistence of some souls. We listened, and each of us took those words home like a grain of chill lodged in the throat. I moved away from Bayou Hollow some years later. The city swallowed me like a tide. Work, noise, crowds, but the memory does not wash out. Even now, when I see a thin, tall man on a roadside under the sodium glow of the street lamp, my chest tightens. When silence stretches in the night and a sound like distant crying slips in from somewhere, a cold shiver runs down my spine. Perhaps that night was nothing more than a nightmare born of fear and storm. Perhaps the cry was only the wind passing through the hollow reeds. Yet my gut insists otherwise. That night we witnessed something that was not wholly ordinary. Something, or someone, stood in the mud among the graves and unearthed things that had better been left alone. Sometimes when I walk past the churchyard in the city, and yes, even here there are graves tucked behind a brick fence, I feel the same uneasy prickling on the back of my neck. The oak silhouette in my memory still rises black against the rain. I sometimes ask myself over and over, who was that shadow by the oak tree? What was he digging for? And whose voice was crying in the rain? The answers remain buried deep in the mud of that cursed night, because some mysteries are not made to be unraveled. They exist to haunt us. I do not speak of this often. When I do, people nod politely, exchange a smile, and change the subject. But those who stood with me in the mud that night, if you meet them in town, you will see the same thing in their faces. A small, quick flinch at the mention of the word grave. A silence when storms gather. They do not bring it up because some stories, once told, refuse to let you go. Years have passed. I have a life that looks normal. I have learned to bury my fear under common things. Groceries, bills, the commute. But at night, sometimes, as thunder rolls over the city windows and rain drums a steady tattoo on the glass, I wake with a cold that is not entirely the weather. The sound of a single distant cry will tug me like a thread, and suddenly the night of the burial stands again before my eyes. The ragged figure in the cane, the feet pressed into the earth, the coins and brittle bones scattered in the mud, the hushed crow shadows watching the grave. Even now, if you stand at the edge of a marsh in Louisiana when the rains come down hard, you will hear the reeds whispering. You cannot tell whether some of those sounds are only wind and water, or whether a memory is being carried back to the place where it began. I do not know who or what visited us that night. Maybe it was the hermit spirit, returning to the site of old experiments. Maybe it was something less precise, some force that touches the thin places between life and death and brushes us like hands through mist. I only know that the place where the world stayed ordinary until then is not ordinary anymore for me. I have tried, in my better moments, to think of a rational explanation. Maybe the villagers who saw the figure were simply seeing what grief and weather conjured. Maybe the coins were placed as offerings, and the bones were animal remains that washed up in the mud. Those are convenient answers, but they do not account for the silence of the crows, the way the soil seemed to move, or the woman's cry that came from no body. They do not explain how the shadow seemed determined, methodical, as if following a plan. So I carry the memory, and I tell this story quietly, because telling it seems to keep some small distance between my life and that night. I write this down, not to frighten you, but because explanation feels impossible, and the telling is the only thread I have left to hold on to that does not make me entirely alone. If any reader ever finds themselves walking through a cemetery after a storm and hears a muffled scrape of something shifting beneath the wet soil, do not only assume it is the wind. Listen closely. If your skin crawls and a single name arrives at the edge of your thought like a blade, heed it. Some doors, once prodded, reveal mouths that will not close. I do not know what rose from the grave that night. I do not know whether the shadow sought a hidden treasure or whether Mr. Nelson's body was its intent. That mystery remains unresolved to this day. I left Bayou Hollow long ago, but the night lives in me, like a cool, constant shadow. Years have passed. I go about my days, I keep my routines, but sometimes, in the quiet that follows the city's roar, the scene returns, the reed-bent figures standing by the oak. Even now, I sometimes hear a whisper in the trees. Who was that shadow by the oak? What was he digging for? Whose voice cried in the rain? We keep asking because some things will not let us rest until they have been asked. Through season after season, The riddle remains, and perhaps it will remain until the end.